A child's voice, steady but fragile, stood against laughter and disbelief in a room built on authority. She claimed something the world insisted was impossible, yet her conviction never wavered. What followed was not just a legal fight, but a revelation that turned ridicule into silence. This is a story of courage that will grip you until the very end. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more, and share in the comments what part strikes you most and where you're watching from today. 12-year-old Zariah Ellington, a black girl with unshaken composure, sat in the Philadelphia County Courthouse. Her small hands folded neatly on her lap, as though she knew that even the slightest fidget would be seized upon as weakness. She was the only child of Dr. Malcolm Ellington, a quiet but determined history lecturer at a local university, and Commander Celine Ellington, a mother whose repeated absences over the years had been twisted into a narrative of neglect. The courtroom was filled with anticipation, its tall windows casting pale light across the oak-paneled walls, while the air buzzed with the faint whispers of spectators eager to witness the continuation of a custody battle that had dragged on far too long. At the front of the room sat Judge Clarence Whitmore, a white man with a career carved first in the Navy and then on the bench, his reputation for severity well known across the state. His military bearing was unmistakable. Back straight, chin high, eyes sharp enough to slice through any pretense. To him, this case was simple. A mother who refused to appear was a mother unfit to raise a child. He had little patience for what he called excuses, and even less for claims he deemed imaginative. Malcolm sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, his tie too tight against his throat, his eyes darting constantly to his daughter as though afraid she might disappear if he looked away. He had been both father and mother for so long that the thought of losing Zariah felt unbearable. Beside him, his attorney adjusted a neat stack of papers that contained years' worth of documented absences, birthdays without phone calls, hospital visits without a mother's hand to hold, recitals performed to an empty chair. Across from them stood Meredith Hale, a sharp-eyed attorney for the absent mother, whose perfectly pressed suit and calculating expression made her look like a predator circling its prey. She adjusted her files with a deliberate air of confidence, already certain the court would side with her narrative that Celine Ellington was unreliable, inconsistent, and undeserving of custody. The bailiff called for order as Judge Whitmore entered, the entire room rising in automatic deference to the man whose gavel carried the weight of authority. Whitmore scanned the room with cool detachment before taking his seat. "We are here today to continue the custody hearing for the minor, Zariah Ellington," he declared. His eyes, pale and assessing, flicked toward Malcolm. "I understand the respondent has once again failed to appear." Malcolm's attorney rose at once, his voice steady but edged with restrained frustration. "Yes, Your Honor, Miss. Celine Ellington has failed to appear for the third consecutive hearing. This pattern of absence speaks volumes about her priorities. We ask that full custody be granted to Dr. Ellington, with supervised visitation only when Miss Ellington chooses to make herself available." Judge Whitmore nodded slightly, jotting down notes as though the argument confirmed what he already believed. Meredith Hale rose smoothly in response, her tone carrying a veneer of professionalism wrapped around a blade of condescension. "Your Honor, my client has explained that her work prevents her from attending these hearings. She claims her responsibilities are critical, yet she provides no evidence, no supervisor's contact, no official documentation, not even a consistent explanation. Her repeated absence demonstrates a lack of commitment to her child's well-being." A ripple of agreement moved through the gallery, and Judge Whitmore leaned back, his pen tapping rhythmically against the bench. His eyes shifted from the attorneys to the girl sitting at the table, his tone softening slightly but still commanding. "I would like to hear from the minor herself. Zariah Ellington, please step forward." The room seemed to hold its breath as Zariah rose. Though only 12, her movements carried a calm gravity that silenced the whispers. She walked to the stand, her neat braid swinging lightly against her back, and clutched the small bronze compass pendant around her neck before setting her hands firmly in her lap. The bailiff swore her in, and she raised her hand with the quiet determination of someone who had prepared for this moment. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Tell us, Zariah, about your relationship with your mother." Zariah's voice, though soft, carried clearly through the chamber. "She loves me," she said firmly. "She can't always be here, But it's not because she doesn't want to. Murmurs stirred in the gallery, but Whitmore's expression remained unchanged. Why can't she be here? Has she explained her absences to you? Zariah's fingers brushed the compass once more, as though it steadied her. She lifted her chin, her dark eyes locking onto his. She can't tell us where she goes, she said evenly. It's classified. The word hit the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward into gasps and whispers. Judge Whitmore arched an eyebrow, clearly amused. Classified? He repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. Meredith Hale allowed herself a visible smirk, confident this claim would dismantle the child's credibility. Yet Zariah did not falter. She straightened in her seat and spoke with a clarity that defied her years. She serves in a special Navy program. She's one of the first female Navy SEALs. For a moment, silence gripped the courtroom. Then laughter erupted, sharp, dismissive, cruel. The gallery chuckled. The attorneys exchanged knowing looks, and even Judge Whitmore's mouth curved into the faintest smile of disbelief. Zariah, however, did not falter, her small fingers brushing against the bronze compass pendant she wore around her neck, her thumb tracing the familiar grooves as if drawing strength from its presence. And when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet conviction that seemed far too mature for her 12 years. She explained that she had once found her mother's training journals, filled with entries describing swimming distances, combat drills, and instructor names that no ordinary person could casually know. She told the court how she had overheard secure phone calls when her mother thought she was asleep, conversations peppered with codes and military references that confirmed she was not living an ordinary life. The opposing counsel, Meredith Hale, rose with a smirk stretched across her face, her heels clicking against the polished wood floor as she approached the witness stand with calculated confidence, her tone carrying a false kindness that barely concealed the ridicule beneath it, as she suggested Zariah was making things up, perhaps out of loyalty to her absent mother or a child's desire to protect a parent from consequences. Zariah met her gaze directly, her voice cutting through the mockery, insisting that her mother had never told her directly about her role, that she had pieced it together herself, that the scars, the calluses, the relentless training she glimpsed in quiet moments spoke louder than words ever could. Meredith tilted her head, pretending sympathy as she pressed harder, asking whether Zariah's father had put the idea into her head, whether he had whispered these stories to give his daughter hope, whether this entire narrative was just a fabrication crafted to excuse a mother who was never there. The objection from Malcolm's attorney came swiftly, his voice raised with fire as he accused Meredith of badgering the child, and Judge Whitmore reluctantly sustained it, though his eyes betrayed the same skepticism that lingered in the room. Zariah did not wait to be invited to continue, her young voice carrying its own authority as she explained that neither of her parents had ever told her anything, that her father knew little beyond the word government work, and that she had always kept her conclusions to herself because she knew no one would believe her. The compass pendant caught the light as she held it briefly in her palm, a symbol of resilience in the face of derision, and she spoke again with measured force. Just because adults do not tell you something does not mean you cannot figure it out. A murmur swept through the gallery, some impressed by the girl's composure, others shaking their heads at what they believed to be childish imagination, while Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, pen tapping against his notes as if weighing whether the child was misguided or manipulative. His lips pressed into a thin line before he finally spoke, giving her one last chance to retract her words, warning that lying in a courtroom was a serious matter and that her story dishonored servicemen who risked their lives. For the first time, Zariah's voice wavered, but not with fear, rather with emotion, as she declared that she was telling the truth, that her mother loved her, that her absences were never by choice, and that she was not a liar, only a daughter telling the truth that nobody wanted to hear. Malcolm rose halfway to his feet, pride burning through the anger that colored his cheeks, his hands tightening on the table as though restraining himself from shouting, while the judge's warning glare forced him back down. The tension in the room grew unbearable, every person waiting for the next word, the next revelation, as the courtroom balanced on the knife edge of disbelief and conviction. Then, in that fragile moment, a court officer approached the bench with hurried steps, his voice low as he whispered into Judge Whitmore's ear, and the judge's stern expression shifted ever so slightly, first confusion, then something unreadable, a flicker of unease betraying the certainty he had worn like armor. The judge cleared his throat, his tone abruptly formal, as he announced that the court would take a brief recess, instructing all present to remain within the chamber, his words offering no explanation for the sudden interruption. Attorneys exchanged nervous glances, spectators leaned in close to murmur, and Zariah returned to her seat beside her father, clutching the compass tightly as though sensing the weight of what was coming. The courtroom settled back into an uneasy rhythm after the abrupt recess was called, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore, every person in the gallery whispering as if speculating about what the officer had whispered into Judge Whitmore's ear. Yet the judge returned to his bench with an expression of forced calm, his pen poised over his notepad while his eyes flicked toward Zariah once again, clearly determined to strip away what he believed was a child's fabrication. He adjusted his glasses, his tone clipped as he told the opposing counsel to continue her questioning, and Meredith Hale wasted no time in approaching the stand with a deliberate stride, her heels echoing sharply across the wooden floor, her smirk thin but unmistakable as though she could already taste victory. She leaned in just enough to loom over the small black girl in the witness chair, her voice smooth but carrying the sting of condescension as she accused Zariah of inventing stories because she felt abandoned by her mother, implying that this fantasy of female Navy SEALs was nothing more than the desperate imagination of a neglected child. The gallery chuckled again, some muffling their laughter behind their hands, while others shook their heads at the audacity of a 12-year-old trying to convince a court of something even seasoned adults found impossible. Judge Whitmore tapped his gavel lightly, not to silence the laughter entirely, but to restore enough order for the proceedings to continue, his lips pressed in that same thin smile of disbelief, as though daring the child to continue digging herself deeper into a hole. Zariah sat perfectly upright, her braid resting against her back, her fingers wrapped tightly around the compass pendant as she listened to the attorney's accusations, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, sharp and precise, far beyond her years. She insisted that her mother had never once instructed her to lie, that her conclusions had come from observations no child could mistake, scars that did not match accidents, strength and reflexes that surpassed ordinary training, journals filled with drills no civilian mother would need to complete, and conversations overheard late at night that contained the cadence of military code. Meredith narrowed her eyes, her tone sharpening as she pressed harder, asking whether Zariah truly believed she could understand military language, whether she had perhaps seen something else and simply misunderstood, suggesting again that her father had planted the seed of this fantasy. Malcolm, sitting at the plaintiff's table, slammed his hand on the wood in protest, his voice ringing out as he demanded respect for his daughter. But Judge Whitmore snapped his head toward him, his voice booming as he warned Dr. Ellington that one more outburst would result in contempt of court, forcing the father back into his seat, his chest heaving with restrained fury. Zariah, however, did not look rattled. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the judge himself, her voice rising slightly for the first time, as she declared that adults may underestimate children, but children notice what others overlook, and just because they are not told the truth directly does not mean they cannot discover it. The gallery fell into silence at her words, not out of belief but from the sheer boldness of a 12-year-old standing her ground against both a white judge and a white attorney determined to dismantle her testimony. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaling in irritation before speaking with deliberate weight, telling Zariah that the courtroom was no place for fabrications, that lies, even from children, would be punished, and that her insistence dishonored the men who had given their lives in military service. His words carried not just skepticism, but the heavy undertone of disdain, the dismissal of a black child's voice as irrelevant against the authority of white power. Zariah's composure cracked for the briefest of moments, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as her voice trembled, yet she did not retract a word. Instead, she declared that her mother loved her, that her mother was serving the country in ways people could not understand, and that she was not lying even if nobody in the room believed her. A low rumble of discontent moved through the gallery, some shaking their heads in pity, while others whispered that the girl should be disciplined for lying under oath. But there were a few, only a few, who looked at her with something approaching admiration, though their voices were drowned out by the tide of disbelief. Meredith leaned back, folding her arms with satisfaction, certain that the girl had exposed herself as delusional, and Judge Whitmore nodded as though confirming that view, making another note on his pad, his expression unreadable, yet marked with arrogance. The tension in the air thickened once more, every eye fixed on the child who refused to bend, every whisper feeding the fire of disbelief. And though Zariah sat small in the witness chair, her shoulders were squared, her chin lifted, her presence a quiet rebellion against the authority arrayed against her. Malcolm leaned forward, his eyes locked on his daughter, pride burning beneath his restrained anger, while the compass pendant glinted faintly in the courtroom light, a reminder that Zariah held on to something none of the others could see: the certainty of her mother's truth. Judge Whitmore finally leaned forward, his tone heavy as he told the girl that the court would give her one last chance to tell the truth, implying that any continued fabrication would weigh heavily against her mother's case, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath as silence stretched, waiting to see whether the child would falter. But Zariah lifted her chin higher, her dark eyes unwavering, her voice clear as she repeated almost defiantly that her mother was one of the first female Navy SEALs, that she had seen enough, heard enough, and understood enough to know that what she said was true. The courtroom erupted again in a mixture of laughter, scorn, and murmurs, but beneath it all there was a subtle current of unease, a growing sense that perhaps the child's confidence was not born of fantasy but of knowledge no one else possessed. And though the majority dismissed her words, a few exchanged glances that betrayed doubt in the certainty of the judge's stance. It was at that moment, just as the room threatened to descend into chaos once more, that the courtroom officer who had whispered to the judge earlier returned, his steps urgent, his hand clutching a folder, and he bent low again to speak into Judge Whitmore's ear. This time, the judge's expression did not simply flicker. It shifted dramatically, his eyes widening, his jaw tightening, the pen in his hand pausing mid-stroke, as though the certainty of his authority had been shaken. He straightened slowly, his voice unsteady for the first time as he announced another short recess, ordering all parties to remain in the courtroom, his words clipped and devoid of explanation, and the gallery erupted again with whispers, confusion, and nervous energy. The atmosphere in the courtroom was shifting in a way that none of the spectators could ignore, the weight of disbelief still pressing down on young Zariah, yet now layered with something else. A tremor of unease that had begun when the officer whispered into Judge Whitmore's ear and deepened when the judge returned to the bench with his composure cracked, his certainty dented, and his confidence shaken, even if he tried to mask it with the stern set of his jaw and the clipped tone of his voice. The gallery murmured quietly, heads leaning toward one another, speculation buzzing like static in the air, as if every person sensed that something larger than a custody battle was unfolding in front of them. Judge Whitmore, normally a man who reveled in his authority, now shuffled his papers with uncharacteristic hesitation, his pale eyes flicking across the room as though he could not quite settle his focus, and when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the firm resonance it had carried earlier. He announced that the court would take a brief recess and that all parties were to remain seated and present within the chamber, his words delivered without explanation, his tone betraying unease that sent another ripple through the spectators. Meredith Hale frowned, confusion crossing her carefully controlled features, her hand tightening on her stack of documents, while Malcolm Ellington leaned toward his attorney with a questioning look, only to be met with a shrug that conveyed more uncertainty than reassurance. Zariah returned from the stand to her father's side, her small frame tense but unbroken, the compass pendant clutched so tightly in her hand that the edges pressed into her palm, yet her eyes never left the judge, studying him with the same sharp observance that had carried her testimony. The gallery could not contain its whispers, and though the bailiff barked for silence, the quiet hum of speculation persisted, a restless undercurrent that refused to be quelled. Judge Whitmore disappeared briefly through a side door, his black robe swaying behind him, leaving the courtroom suspended in limbo, the absence of authority making the air heavier, the walls closing in on everyone who waited. Malcolm bent toward his daughter, his voice low, asking if she was frightened, but Zariah shook her head firmly, whispering that she had only spoken the truth, that the truth would stand even if no one believed her, and though her words carried the conviction of youth, they also seemed to strike something deeper in her father, who looked at her with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Minutes dragged with excruciating slowness, each tick of the courthouse clock echoing like a drumbeat in the silence, each cough or shuffle of feet magnified in the oppressive stillness, until finally the heavy doors at the side of the chamber creaked open and Judge Whitmore returned. His steps were slower, his face paler, his eyes holding a strange combination of disbelief and restraint, as though he had been confronted with information that both challenged and unsettled the foundation of his authority. He seated himself with deliberate slowness, arranging his papers carefully, his composure restored on the surface but thinner now, more fragile, a mask of control stretched over a crack that refused to vanish. When he spoke, his voice was neutral, stripped of its earlier arrogance, each word measured with caution. He informed the courtroom that additional testimony relevant to the case was forthcoming, that a witness would be allowed to appear immediately, and that this was a matter of priority that would not be delayed. Meredith Hale immediately stood, outrage and confusion flashing across her face as she objected, demanding advance notice of such testimony and time to prepare, but Judge Whitmore cut her off with a firm shake of his head, stating that the circumstances left no room for delay and that she would understand soon enough. The gallery stirred again, speculation rising to fever pitch, and Zariah sat forward in her chair, her compass still gripped in her hand, her heart pounding not from fear but from recognition that the storm she had long carried in secret was about to break wide open in front of everyone who had doubted her. The bailiff moved to the large double doors at the back of the courtroom, his steps deliberate, his posture unusually stiff, and with one practiced motion, he swung the doors open. A hush fell instantly over the room, the whispers dying on lips mid-sentence, the tension collapsing into silence so heavy it felt as though the air itself had been drained from the chamber. Every head turned, every eye widened, as the first figure stepped through the doorway. For Zariah, the sight was both familiar and surreal, her breath catching in her throat, her hand tightening around the compass until her knuckles whitened, her eyes widening in awe as she rose slightly from her seat without realizing it. For Judge Whitmore, the sight struck him like a blow, his face draining of color, his pen falling from his hand to the desk without a sound, his carefully constructed authority shattering in an instant as he rose to his feet, his military instincts overriding his judicial composure. The gallery gasped collectively, disbelief written on every face, the tension of the moment breaking into a stunned silence that reverberated through the chamber. The heavy wooden doors of the Philadelphia courtroom swung open with a sound that seemed to cut through every whisper and every heartbeat, the hinges groaning like a warning before giving way to a sight that froze the entire room in place, and the air that had moments before been thick with mockery and disbelief now transformed into something electric, tense, and unshakably reverent. The first figure through the doorway was Commander Celine Ellington, a black woman whose absence had been painted as neglect and irresponsibility, but who now appeared in full navy dress blues, the fabric pressed to immaculate perfection, the polished shoes striking the marble floor with steady and deliberate rhythm, and the rows of medals pinned to her chest catching the light in dazzling flashes that demanded recognition even from those who had sworn such a woman could not exist. Her posture was unyielding, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted with the kind of quiet strength that came only from years of surviving what others could not endure, and though she was not the tallest person in the room, her presence was enormous, filling the chamber with a weight of authority that silenced laughter before it could even form. Behind her marched 6 Navy SEALs in precise formation, their uniforms crisp, their faces carved into impassive masks of discipline, 3 men and 3 women moving in perfect synchronization, each step a drumbeat that echoed across the courtroom and reverberated in the chest of every spectator, who now stared wide-eyed at the living contradiction of everything Judge Whitmore and the opposing counsel had insisted was impossible. The transformation of the gallery was instantaneous. The spectators who had smirked and chuckled at Zariah's words now sat rigid, their jaws slack, their laughter choked into silence as reality crushed the fragile scaffolding of their disbelief. Judge Clarence Whitmore himself, who had spent decades cultivating the air of unshakable authority, visibly faltered, his face paling, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the bench to steady himself, his eyes darting from the insignia on Celine's uniform to the faces of the SEALs behind her, reading in an instant the truth he had dismissed with smug certainty. The gavel that had silenced so many in the past now sat idle, powerless against the authority that strode uninvited into his courtroom, an authority that came not from legal robes but from years of grueling training, clandestine missions, and service shrouded in secrecy. Zariah's breath caught in her throat as she watched her mother step forward, the compass pendant in her hand pressed so tightly against her palm it left an imprint, her wide eyes filling with tears of vindication and pride, her small frame trembling not with fear, but with the release of years of disbelief finally cracking open into truth, and in that moment, the gulf between what she knew and what the world had denied collapsed into nothing. Malcolm Ellington remained frozen beside his daughter, his expression caught between pride, shock, and the sting of realization, his years of anger at his wife's absences colliding with the undeniable proof that she had not abandoned her family but had been serving in ways he could never have imagined, the bitterness of lost years mixing with the vindication that his daughter had spoken only the truth. Meredith Hale, who only moments earlier had ridiculed Zariah with smug certainty, now sat stiff and pale, her smirk erased, her hands fumbling uselessly with her papers as if searching for an argument that no longer existed, her face betraying the panic of someone watching the foundation of her case crumble into dust. Commander Celine Ellington marched with steady rhythm until she reached the appropriate distance from the bench, her team halting behind her in perfect unison, their boots striking the floor with military precision as they stopped and shifted into parade rest. Forming a wall of human steel behind the woman who had been accused of abandonment, their presence itself a statement that demanded respect. Celine raised her right hand in a crisp salute, her voice strong and clear as she announced, "Commander Celine Ellington, United States Navy, reporting as ordered. Your Honor." The words cut through the chamber like a blade. And for a moment, the silence was so complete that the sound of Judge Whitmore's shallow breathing was audible, his instincts overriding his skepticism as his hand rose almost reflexively to return the salute, his years in the Navy betraying him into honoring the authority he had denied. His face betrayed the struggle between disbelief and recognition, his earlier mockery now burned away by the searing light of proof standing before him, and as he lowered his hand, his expression had changed, the arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like reverence. Celine lowered her arm and, with a controlled motion, handed a sealed folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge's bench, her voice steady as she declared that the documents within had been declassified that very morning for the purpose of this hearing. Documents that would confirm not only her role, but also the truth of everything her daughter had testified. Judge Whitmore opened the folder with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the first page, and as he turned each sheet, his face changed again, disbelief melting into shock, shock into acknowledgement, acknowledgement into the kind of humbled silence that comes only when one's certainty has been shattered by undeniable fact. The seals behind Celine shifted only once, moving in perfect unison to stand directly behind Zariah, forming an unspoken shield of validation and protection, their presence sending a message that no argument could undo. The girl had spoken truth, and she was no longer alone in carrying it. Lieutenant Cale Montgomery, the tall black operator at the far end of the line, allowed himself one brief human gesture, resting a firm and steady hand on Zariah's shoulder before returning to formation, and the child's eyes widened as her composure cracked for only an instant into a small, tremulous smile, her truth finally visible to all. The silence that followed Commander Celine Ellington's entrance was unlike anything the Philadelphia courtroom had ever witnessed, a silence so absolute it felt like the air had been sucked out of the chamber, the laughter and mockery from earlier now exposed as hollow echoes against the authority embodied in the black woman standing tall in her immaculate dress blues, with the gleaming medals testifying to years of sacrifice. While behind her the 6 seals held their formation like statues of living steel, their presence confirming with every disciplined breath that Zariah's testimony had not been fantasy but fact. Judge Clarence Whitmore, who had once smirked at the notion of a female Navy SEAL, now looked visibly shaken as he opened the sealed folder Celine had delivered, his hands trembling slightly despite his attempt to maintain judicial composure, his pale eyes darting across the declassified documents that spoke with more authority than his gavel ever could, the truth unraveling page by page until his posture seemed to collapse under the weight of it. The gallery, packed with spectators who had ridiculed Zariah only moments earlier, now leaned forward in breathless silence, their expressions a mixture of shock, disbelief, and awe as they stared at the impossible sight of a black woman whose existence defied the certainty of their prejudice, her uniform glowing beneath the courtroom lights as a silent rebuke to every dismissive laugh. Celine did not falter under their stares. Instead, she remained perfectly composed, her chin lifted, her voice measured as she explained that the documents had been declassified that very morning to allow for her testimony, that they contained evidence not only of her own service, but also of the classified program that had integrated women into naval special warfare, a program whose secrecy had demanded her silence for years, and whose existence now vindicated her daughter's unwavering defense of the truth. Judge Whitmore swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance stripped away, his voice subdued as he asked the bailiff to hand copies of the documents to both sets of counsel, and Meredith Hale's hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages, her face blanching as the undeniable proof stared back at her, shredding the case she had built on accusations of neglect and abandonment, her smirk gone, replaced by a mask of stunned inadequacy. Zoraya, sitting beside her father, felt her chest swell with vindication as the compass pendant pressed against her palm, her eyes fixed on her mother, whose presence now filled the space with unshakable authority, the image of her standing in full uniform with her SEAL unit behind her, searing itself into memory as the moment that transformed ridicule into reverence. The SEALs themselves moved only once, their formation breaking with precision as they marched in step toward Zoraya, their boots striking the floor in rhythm until they came to a stop behind her, forming a human wall of validation that shielded her from the disbelief that had bruised her hours before, their bodies a living declaration that she had not lied, that her courage in the face of mockery had been justified all along. Lieutenant Cale Montgomery, the tall black operator whose presence radiated both strength and steadiness, allowed himself one subtle gesture, resting a firm hand on Zoraya's shoulder before snapping back into position, his touch carrying the weight of unspoken solidarity that told her she was not alone, that her words had carried her until her mother and the truth could finally stand beside her. The spectators sat frozen, some with mouths slightly open, others blinking rapidly as though trying to wake from a dream, but no one spoke. No one dared to interrupt the transformation of the narrative, the courtroom no longer a place of ridicule but a stage where hidden truth was finally revealed with force undeniable. Judge Whitmore, who had mocked her testimony only an hour earlier, now sat pale and humbled, his pen idle on the bench as he continued to read, his lips tightening as each page destroyed the certainty of his earlier words, his pride unraveling as the proof of Celine's service demanded acknowledgement he could no longer deny. Malcolm Ellington's expression was conflicted, pride and vindication clashing with the bitterness of lost years, his eyes fixed on the woman he had once believed had abandoned their daughter, his heart torn between admiration for the strength before him and sorrow for the moments missed, birthdays uncelebrated, hospital rooms endured without a mother's comfort. Yet for Zoraya, none of that mattered now. What mattered was that she had spoken truth, that she had endured the cruel laughter of those who doubted her, and that her truth now stood visible for all to see. Her mother's presence and her unit's solidarity erasing every sneer, every smirk, every whispered accusation of lies. Celine's voice carried across the chamber once more, clear and controlled, as she explained that the secrecy of the program had demanded her absences, that she had been forbidden to disclose even to her family where she went or why, that every moment she had missed in her daughter's life had been spent in service to a mission greater than herself, a mission whose existence was now documented and undeniable. Meredith Hale attempted to rise, her voice faltering as she stammered a protest about fairness and preparation, but the words fell limp in the air, powerless against the reality standing before her, and the judge silenced her with a raised hand. His voice clipped as he reminded her that the truth required no preparation, that the proof spoke for itself. The silence that gripped the courtroom after Celine Ellington's presence and the undeniable weight of the documents stretched on until Judge Clarence Whitmore finally cleared his throat, his voice quieter than before as he announced that the hearing would continue in chambers with limited attendance, instructing that only the parties, their counsel, and the minor child would accompany him. And though the gallery erupted in whispers of outrage at being excluded from what had become the most dramatic proceeding in years, the bailiff quickly restored order as the judge rose from the bench, his robe brushing the wood as he stepped away with papers clutched tightly in his hand, his composure visibly altered. Malcolm Ellington placed a protective arm around Zoraya's shoulders as they followed, the child still clutching her compass pendant as though it tethered her to the truth she had defended, while Celine marched with measured precision beside her counsel, her uniform a silent rebuke to everyone who had doubted her, and the SEAL unit remained behind, their stoic presence lingering in the courtroom as a symbol of the reality that had upended every assumption. Inside the judge's chambers, the atmosphere was intimate but no less charged, the walls lined with military memorabilia and shelves of law books, two worlds that reflected Whitmore's life now colliding in ways he had never imagined. And as he sat behind his desk, he looked at Celine with something approaching humility, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant apology as he admitted that the documents confirmed the existence of a program he had once dismissed as impossible. Celine sat with perfect posture, her expression composed though her eyes betrayed the strain of years of secrecy, and she explained that she had been one of the first women selected for the Integrated Naval Special Warfare Initiative, a classified program that demanded absolute silence, a duty that required her to vanish from her daughter's life for months or years at a time without explanation, her absences not neglect but necessity, her silence not cruelty but obedience to orders. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice thick with emotion, as he demanded to know whether every missed birthday, every hospital stay, every sleepless night had truly been sacrificed on the altar of national security, and Celine's voice, steady though cracked at the edges, admitted that yes, every absence had been real, and every sacrifice undeniable, but none had been without cost, and the heaviest burden had been carried not by her, but by her daughter who had been forced to endure disbelief and loneliness in her stead. Zariah, sitting small in the chair beside her father, lifted her chin with the same composure she had shown on the stand, and she spoke softly but firmly, revealing that she had pieced together the truth years earlier from journals she had found, from overheard conversations, from scars that told stories of battles fought in silence, and though she had never confronted her mother directly, she had carried the knowledge like a hidden flame, holding on to it even as everyone around her called her a liar. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the child, his voice softened as he acknowledged that few adults would have shown such resilience, that even he had been blinded by assumptions, that her courage had exposed the limitations of his authority, and for the first time since the hearing began, the balance of power shifted fully towards Zariah, her presence commanding the room as surely as her mother's uniform. Celine turned to her daughter then, her military bearings softening as she confessed that she had requested a transfer to stateside training operations, still classified but with predictable hours, a change that would allow her to be present in ways she had not been before, and though her voice carried professional control, her eyes shone with something raw and unguarded, a plea for forgiveness without the arrogance to demand it. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he listened, his hand rubbing at his temple as though trying to reconcile years of resentment with the reality now revealed, his voice trembling as he admitted that he had believed she had chosen career over family, that he had thought every absence was abandonment, and now he struggled with the knowledge that she had been serving in ways he could not fathom, that she had carried burdens he could never imagine. Celine's eyes met his, her voice quiet but resolute as she admitted that while she had served her country with pride, she had failed her family in ways that no medal could excuse, that she had asked her daughter to endure what no child should endure, and that she could not undo the lost years, but could only promise to change the future. Zariah clutched her compass tighter, her small voice rising again as she declared that she had always known her mother loved her, that she had always believed the truth even when no one else did, and that she had kept the secret because she knew it mattered, because some truths were worth protecting even when they came at the cost of ridicule. Judge Whitmore, once the embodiment of authority in the courtroom, now looked at the black child before him with something like reverence, acknowledging that she had held more courage in her 12 years than many adults ever displayed, and he turned to Celine, his voice steady as he reminded her that her daughter's strength was proof of both her resilience and her suffering, that the balance of justice demanded not only recognition of her service, but also accountability for the pain her absence had inflicted. The private chamber carried a silence that felt heavier than the one that had filled the courtroom, because now it was not the silence of disbelief or mockery but the silence of reckoning, a space where years of hidden truths were laid bare and could no longer be ignored. And as Celine Ellington sat across from her husband and daughter, her uniform crisp but her eyes weary, she understood that every medal pinned to her chest carried not only stories of battles fought in the shadows, but also scars etched into the heart of her family. Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, his hands folded before him, his pale face marked with the humility of a man who realized his own arrogance had blinded him, and he admitted again that the documents and testimony had confirmed what once seemed impossible, that Celine had served in a program so secret he had not known it existed, but he reminded her with a pointed tone that while the court now recognized her service, it could not erase the cost of her silence. Malcolm sat tense, his fingers gripping the arm of his chair as he wrestled with emotions that churned like a storm inside him. Pride at the truth that his daughter had been right all along clashing with the ache of years spent raising Zariah alone, watching her cry herself to sleep on nights when her mother's absence felt like abandonment, and he turned to Celine with eyes sharp with pain as he asked whether it had been worth it, whether serving in secret missions overseas could possibly justify missing birthdays, graduations, hospital stays, and all the little moments that built the life of a child. Celine inhaled slowly, her back straight but her voice unguarded, admitting that she had asked herself the same question countless times, that for the country the sacrifice had been worth it because the program had opened doors for women, for Black women, who would follow after her, proving that the battlefield of special operations was not bound by gender, but for her daughter the answer was no, because nothing in the world could make up for the moments she had lost with her only child. Zariah listened in silence, her compass pendant pressed to her palm, her dark eyes reflecting both sorrow and strength as she spoke softly, telling her mother that she had always known she loved her, even when she was gone. But what hurt most was not her absence, but the disbelief of everyone around her, the mocking laughter, the dismissive words, the crushing certainty from adults who told her she was lying when all along she had been telling the truth. Celine's composure cracked for the first time, her jaw tightening as tears welled in her eyes, and she reached toward her daughter with a hand that trembled despite the strength it had shown in battle, whispering that she was sorry, that the secrecy had not been her choice but a requirement of duty, and that the greatest burden of her service had been the silence that forced her daughter to stand alone. Judge Whitmore watched the exchange with something like reverence, his earlier disdain erased by the courage before him, and he remarked quietly that Zariah had shown more strength at 12 than many soldiers he had commanded. Her ability to endure disbelief without faltering a testament to her resilience and her mother's influence, even if that influence had been delivered from a distance. Malcolm finally exhaled, his shoulders sagging as he admitted that he had filed for custody because he believed stability mattered more than anything, because he thought Celine had chosen duty over family, but now, faced with the truth, he saw that she had been trapped in a reality that demanded sacrifice at every turn, and though forgiveness would not come quickly, he could no longer deny the honor of her service. Celine nodded, her gaze steady as she explained that her unit had completed their final mission weeks ago, that she had already requested transfer to training operations at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Virginia, that it was still classified but based stateside with predictable hours, and that she had made the decision not just for herself but for Zariah, because the time had come to give her daughter the stability she deserved. Zariah's face lit with a flicker of hope, her lips parting as she asked whether that meant her mother would be home, whether birthdays and recitals would no longer pass without her, and Celine smiled faintly through tears as she promised that no more 6-month deployments would steal her away, that she could be there for weekends, for weeknights, for the life she had missed but was determined not to miss again. Malcolm's eyes softened as he listened, his anger still lingering, but tempered by the sincerity in her words, and though he said little, the slight nod he gave carried volumes, an acknowledgement that perhaps they could rebuild what had been broken. Zariah reached across the space between them, her small hand closing around her mother's, and the compass pendant glinted under the chamber light as though sealing the moment, a symbol of the truth she had carried when no one else would. For the first time in years, Celine allowed herself to release the steel armor she had worn, her hand gripping her daughter's tightly, her voice cracking as she whispered that Zariah had been her strength, her anchor, her reason for enduring every mission, and that seeing her defend the truth against the weight of ridicule was proof that the sacrifices had not destroyed their bond, but had forged it in fire. Judge Whitmore, humbled by what he witnessed, cleared his throat and declared that the record of these proceedings would remain sealed given the classified nature of the testimony, but that the court would take into account the extraordinary circumstances in determining custody, and though his words were formal, his tone betrayed respect for both mother and daughter. The silence of Judge Whitmore's chambers lingered in the air as the family left, their footsteps measured and heavy with the weight of revelations that could no longer be contained. And when Celine Ellington stepped back into the public hallway, her navy uniform still caught the light, but her shoulders were no longer squared in battle posture. They were rounded slightly, softened by the rawness of what she had admitted. And as Malcolm walked beside her with Zariah between them, the three carried not just the burden of the past, but the fragile possibility of healing. The drive back to the Philadelphia suburb where Malcolm and Zariah lived passed in quiet reflection, the hum of the car engine filling the silence that none of them dared to break. And while Celine stared out the window at the familiar streets she had visited so rarely over the past 8 years, her daughter clutched the compass pendant as though it tethered her to the hope that her mother's promise of presence would hold true. When they pulled into the driveway of the colonial-style house with its white trim and a basketball hoop in the driveway, Celine froze for a moment, her eyes tracing the lines of a home that had grown and changed without her, the paint brighter than she remembered, the garden trimmed differently, the porch swing new, and when Zariah pointed out proudly that she had helped paint the trim with her father the previous summer, Celine smiled faintly, her voice thick with the ache of missed memories. Malcolm unlocked the door and stepped aside, a silent gesture of invitation, and Celine entered with hesitant steps, her polished shoes clicking against the floorboards of a space that felt both familiar and foreign, the walls lined with photographs of Zariah's growth, science fairs, soccer tournaments, piano recitals, and birthdays captured without her, each image a testament to the life she had missed while carrying the weight of a secret mission. Celine stopped at each picture, her eyes lingering on her daughter's smile, her hands tracing the frame of a recital photo, her throat tightening as she whispered that she had missed too much, and Zariah, standing close beside her, touched her arm gently, saying softly that she had kept albums and saved memories for her, that she had made sure nothing would be lost if her mother ever came home. Malcolm disappeared into the kitchen to prepare dinner, giving mother and daughter the space they needed, and Zariah returned from upstairs carrying a small wooden box she had kept hidden, placing it on the coffee table with a seriousness far beyond her years, explaining that it was filled with things she thought her mother should see, things she had saved in hope that someday she would return. Celine opened the box with trembling fingers, finding inside report cards, ribbons, medals from swimming competitions, handwritten notes, and tiny keepsakes of milestones she had missed. And when she lifted a gold medal for long-distance swimming, Zariah explained proudly that she had started competing when she was 9, that her coach always said she had unusual endurance, and Celine's voice cracked as she whispered that her own mother, Zariah's grandmother, had been a champion swimmer too, that it must run in the blood, and Zariah smiled at the connection, her eyes shining with pride. For the first time in years, the three of them sat together at the dinner table, Malcolm serving plates of food while Celine moved with the stiffness of someone who had not been part of such a simple ritual for far too long, and though the silence at first felt awkward, it slowly softened into cautious conversation, the kind of everyday talk about school, the neighborhood, and work that stitched together the fabric of family. Zariah watched her parents with sharp eyes, noting the way her father's bitterness had softened into something closer to cautious trust, and the way her mother's rigid bearing melted slightly each time she looked at her daughter, as though the medals on her chest mattered less than the simple act of sitting at a table with the family she had nearly lost. After dinner, Zariah cleared the table and lingered at the bottom of the stairs, asking nervously whether her mother would still be there in the morning, and Celine promised softly that she would, that her new orders did not begin until afternoon, and Zariah's smile at that moment carried the fragile joy of a child who had lived too long with disappointment. Later, after Zariah went upstairs to finish homework, Malcolm led Celine to the back porch where the cool autumn air carried the faint scent of leaves, and they sat together on the swing, the distance between them both physical and metaphorical but less vast than it had been that morning, and Malcolm admitted in a low voice that he had never dated anyone else during the years she was gone, that though he had been angry, he had believed in the bond of their marriage, even if he thought it was broken beyond repair. Celine looked at him with eyes that had faced combat, but now filled with something softer, admitting that she had always thought of them, that she had tracked his academic work from afar, that she had read his books and felt proud even when she could not tell him, and for a moment they sat in silence, the ghosts of resentment and devotion mingling in the autumn night. Zariah peeked through the window, her small face framed by the curtain, watching her parents in the dim porch light, sensing that something fragile and precious was beginning to grow, something she had long hoped for but never dared to believe could happen. When she finally went to bed, she placed the compass on the nightstand beside her, her fingers brushing it one last time as she whispered to herself that the truth had changed everything, that her mother had come home not only in uniform but in heart, and as sleep pulled her under, she carried the sound of her parents' low voices on the porch, voices that spoke not of courtrooms and battles, but of forgiveness and family. 2 weeks after the extraordinary hearing that had turned a Philadelphia courtroom into a theater of truth, the Ellington family returned once more to the courthouse, this time not under the shadow of disbelief, but with the weight of vindication and the promise of a new beginning. And when they entered Judge Clarence Whitmore's chambers again, the atmosphere was transformed, the air no longer heavy with mockery but with respect, the judge himself rising from his desk with a humility that had not been present before, his pale eyes settling first on Zariah, the black child whose quiet courage had forced him to confront his arrogance and prejudice, and then on Celine, the black woman whose uniform and declassified documents had shattered his certainty and humbled his authority. Celine wore her service uniform again, though not the full dress blues that had stunned the courtroom, and her posture was still upright but softer, her eyes holding the calm steadiness of someone who no longer needed to prove her worth to anyone but her family. And Malcolm sat beside her, his presence no longer charged with bitterness, but with a quiet acceptance that the woman he had once believed had abandoned them had in fact borne burdens heavier than any he could have imagined. Zariah sat between them, the compass pendant resting against her chest, her eyes bright with a maturity sharpened by years of carrying a secret alone, and the judge began the proceedings by acknowledging that he had reviewed the amended custody agreement submitted by both parties, an agreement that reflected joint custody, equal responsibility, and most importantly, stability for the child who had endured too much uncertainty. He spoke slowly, his tone formal but softened, as he noted that Celine's new assignment at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Virginia would allow her to be home regularly, her hours predictable, her presence real, and that the court saw no reason to deny the arrangement since it was in the best interest of Zariah's well-being. Meredith Hale, once smug and dismissive, now sat in quiet defeat, her objections muted, her sharp edges dulled by the collapse of her case, and the gavel that once carried arrogance now struck with finality, sealing the agreement into law. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun bathed the stone steps in golden light, and as the family descended together, the crowd that had gathered to witness the aftermath parted silently, their eyes following the sight of a black mother, a black father, and their daughter walking in unity where once there had been fracture. Waiting at the base of the steps was Lieutenant Cale Montgomery, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying the same air of discipline and strength, his eyes meeting Celine's with a nod of respect as he informed her quietly that the new program was ready to begin at the training center, that her leadership was expected at dawn, and Celine acknowledged him with a nod, her voice steady as she confirmed she would be there, her duty now balanced between country and family. Zariah tugged gently at her mother's sleeve, her eyes filled with curiosity as she asked what the new program would be, and Celine explained softly that it would be the training of the next generation of women in special operations, building on the legacy her unit had begun. And when Zariah asked if they would hear about her, about the girl who had uncovered the truth and kept it safe, Celine smiled for the first time in years with unguarded warmth and said yes, that her story would be lesson 1, that courage came not only from combat but from conviction, and that the 12-year-old who faced a courtroom of disbelief with nothing but her truth would forever be a reminder of strength. Malcolm laughed quietly, the sound startling in its ease, remarking that such a story might make her head too big, but even he could not hide the pride in his voice as he said it, and Zariah grinned, slipping her hands into both her parents as they walked toward the car, her small body anchoring them together in a way that no court order or official document ever could. That night, back at the family home, the three sat around the dinner table again, their conversation lighter, their silences no longer heavy but comfortable, and afterwards Celine tucked her daughter into bed for the first time in years, her hand smoothing Zariah's hair as she whispered that she would be there in the morning, and when Zariah asked if she promised, Celine answered firmly that she did, that the time of secrecy stealing her away was over. Downstairs on the porch, Malcolm poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to Celine as they sat side by side, the crisp autumn night wrapping around them, and he admitted that though they could never erase the lost years, they could build something new, not the life they had before, but a life forged from truth, forgiveness, and resilience. And Celine nodded, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon, as she whispered that she had fought wars in silence, but the battle for her family was the one that mattered most now. When dawn came, Celine stood in the doorway in her uniform, her bag packed for her first day at the training center, but instead of leaving quietly as she had countless times before, she paused to pour herself a cup of coffee beside her husband, to sit with her daughter for breakfast, to kiss Zoraya's forehead and whisper that she would be home for dinner, and the simple act of staying until the morning sun rose was more powerful than any mission declassified, more meaningful than any medal pinned to her chest. As she drove away, Zoraya watched from the window, her compass in her hand, and she whispered to herself that truth had prevailed, that love had endured, and that no matter how far her mother went, she would never again be alone in carrying it. The end. If this story moved you, let me know by giving it a like and subscribing for more. I'd love to hear what you think about the plot and the way it unfolded. Did the ending surprise you? Or did you see it coming? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Your perspective adds to the conversation, and every comment helps bring these stories to more people.